The night the cameras finally went dark, it felt like the entire block exhaled. Desert rain had just swept across East Mesa, the kind that rolls in like a curtain and leaves everything smelling like creosote and hot asphalt. I stood under the eave with a ceramic mug that said, "Best Dad Even on Mondays," and watched the last red status light on Brent Mallory's ridiculous pole-mounted security system wink out like an embarrassed firefly. People clapped from their porches, honest to goodness clapped, and somewhere a teenager set off a fountain of legal fireworks he had been saving since Independence Day, hissing sparks that reflected in puddles, like the town had decided to hold a prom for the storm. The local news van idled at the corner, the anchor rehearsing lines about privacy and suburban justice and neighbor revenge finally served. My lawyer, Gloria, with the turquoise necklace and a voice like a metronome, handed me a court order with my full name spelled correctly for once, and said, "Congratulations, Evan, you won." I nodded, as if this outcome had been inevitable, as if months of humiliation had not carved new rooms in my skull where shame could live rent-free. The neighbors brought cookies like it was a high school band fundraiser. The president of the Homeowners Association marched down the sidewalk in his cargo shorts, shook my hand, and declared that the community would reaffirm camera angle guidelines, a phrase so vague it could be a sermon or a weather report. I kept smiling and kept saying thank you and kept feeling like I was watching a movie where the hero makes it out alive. Only the hero was me, and I was still waiting for the real villain to step out from behind a saguaro and say that the red lights had only been decoys. By the time the news segment aired that night, the story already sounded like folklore. A neighbor points a camera at a bedroom window, collects and shares footage with the gleeful tone of a gossip columnist who has stolen a diary, and learns that the internet loves a scandal until the scandal comes with a lawyer. The anchor said my name in a careful way, as if the syllables might detonate. The camera panned across the cul-de-sac that looked so ordinary it bordered on satire. American flags, humming air conditioning units, a dented mailbox that had survived 4 holiday seasons and 2 teenagers. The anchor's voice rose on the phrase "neighbor revenge," as if it were the title of a summer blockbuster with a heavy bass line. On screen, they showed the pole where the cameras had once bristled, like the crown of a mechanical porcupine, now bare, rainwater running down the metal in small silver rivers. They showed Brent's stucco castle with the famous bay window that had reflected the setting sun every evening at 5:50, like it was auditioning for a commercial about light. They did not show the clips he had pushed online, because the station had standards, and because a judge had warned anyone with a business license that distributing those clips again would be like swallowing a live wasp. The station cut to Brent on his driveway, wearing a golf polo a size too tight and a smile that begged for applause. He insisted he was a patriot who believed in security. He insisted he had never aimed at our bedroom window, even as a fragment of Arizona sunset glowed on the glass like a slow burn. He insisted someone else had shared the clips, a hacker, a bored college kid, a jealous ex, a Russian bot, a deep state plant. He insisted in so many directions that I half expected his mouth to split into a compass rose and point at every suspect at once. Then the piece cut back to me, and I said the most boring, important sentence of my adult life. I had a reasonable expectation of privacy. The editor let the words hang there like a church bell. It sounded like a spell. It sounded like the first domino falling backward through the months, to the night I realized the camera was not a paranoid dream. When the segment ended, the anchor smiled with teeth so white they could guide ships at sea, and promised a follow-up tomorrow on home surveillance etiquette in the age of everything goes viral, which is the kind of sentence that makes you want to move to a cabin built from library books. I turned the television off and listened to the rain drum the roof, and thought about how neighbor revenge had become an unexpected moral compass on a block where the most heated fights usually involved landscaping rock size. If you flip the story upside down, the ending had always been obvious. The community would not side with the man who pointed a camera at a bedroom. But stories do not unfold because endings are obvious. Stories unfold because someone pretends not to notice a red light, because someone else pretends the law is a costume to be tried on for party laughs, because the internet pretends that shame is entertainment until shame gets subpoenaed. Stories unfold because people like me keep every receipt. I took out the thick binder that Gloria had called my gospel and set it on the kitchen island, next to the puddle of rainwater that had traveled in on my shoes and the cinnamon sugar left by the cookies the windrows brought. There were time-stamped screenshots from streaming sites with names that all sounded like mid-level rock bands. There were printouts from community forums where a certain anonymous account had posted commentary about my curtains, my bedtime, my choice of lampshade, as if a stranger had become a house critic reviewing a private show. There were notes in my own handwriting, 7 different pens, dates and times, and little arrows pointing to patterns like a suburban detective who refused to wear a hat. There were photos of the camera at different angles, morning and night, desert dawn casting long blue shadows, high noon flattening everything to a sun-bleached postcard. There were signed statements from neighbors who had seen the camera drift like a hawk, and there was a receipt from a hardware store where Brent had purchased a shipment of little metal arms that looked robotic and somehow aggressive. I flipped to the first page, the night this all began, and the story tilted backward like a roller coaster cresting the hill. It was a Tuesday in late March, which already sounds like an alibi. I had carried a basket of laundry down the hall and into the bedroom, humming a country song I will deny later. My wife, Dana, was at her sister's in Tempe helping wrangle newborn twins, and the house felt honest and quiet, the kind of quiet that tells you live in a good place. I lifted the blinds one slat to gauge the sunset, because I have always been susceptible to sunsets. And that is when I saw it, a pinpoint of red hovering above the shared fence line like a cherry eye. It stared without blinking. It hummed an insect hum that made me think of fluorescent lights in gas station bathrooms. I leaned closer and the dot widened into a small glass circle that reflected back the room in a funhouse smear. I lowered the blind and lifted it again as if this were a magic trick performed for an audience of towels. The red dot did not vanish. The camera was mounted on a pole just high enough to see into the second floor, angled like a neck craned over a cubicle. From where I stood, it was pointed at my chest. I did the American thing, which is to grant the benefit of the doubt as a warm-up for rage. Maybe it was a weird angle, I told myself. Maybe it only caught the roofline. Maybe this was a false positive brought on by too much coffee and a podcast about surveillance. I stood in the doorway and held my phone and grew very still, the way one does when one discovers a tiny spider on a shirt sleeve and decides that stillness is bravery. Then I texted Brent, because we were neighbors and because I thought neighbors could still be people who solve things without a Greek chorus. I wrote, "Hello Brent, I believe one of your cameras may be facing our window. Would you mind adjusting the angle?" He wrote back 15 minutes later with a thumbs up, and I stared at that thumb like it was a witness refusing to testify. The camera did not move. The first night I slept with the blinds closed tight and a spare blanket jammed into the crack like a draft stopper. I woke at 3 in the morning to the sensation that the house was holding its breath. I went to the window and lifted one slat. The red dot stared in, patient as a long game. I pulled out my phone and recorded 10 seconds of video like I had been trained by the internet to collect my own proof. The next morning, I knocked on Brent's door, and he answered in a robe with a gold rope tie, which is the kind of detail a novelist invents. Except this happened in a neighborhood where a man once dressed as a medieval knight to hand out Halloween candy. Brent smiled and worded me to death. "It is for coyote patrol, Evan. It is for package theft prevention. It is an unfortunate coincidence that the angle captures your home. I am a supporter of safety. We all must be vigilant." He used the word vigilant 3 times as if it were a calorie-free dessert he wanted me to try. He promised to adjust the mount by evening. When I returned home, the red dot winked at me like we shared a private joke. I found the first clip 2 days later. A coworker, Darius, leaned over the divider at the insurance office and asked if I knew someone had posted a video of "a room that looks like your room, man," on a forum that specializes in neighborhood shenanigans. I clicked a link I wish I had never clicked, and there it was, a jittery slice of my life stolen by a lens, a man in a t-shirt sorting laundry, a close-up of a bedside lamp flicking off, the faint outline of a person crossing from closet to dresser, the glass of water I keep by the bed catching a reflection like a storm. The caption was the kind of joke that left bruises. It implied I had staged a show for the block. It implied permission that had never been given. The comments were a bonfire, that collective carnival where strangers pretend they are jurors and poets and comedians. I took screenshots of every comment, every timestamp, every nickname that seemed to know too much. When I got home, I told Dana everything. She listened without interrupting, then she dragged the dresser against the window like a barricade in a disaster movie and said, I want this man to know we are not props. The next week stretched like gum stuck under a table. I kept a notebook on the kitchen counter and wrote down the times the camera moved. I bought a cheap tripod and filmed the red dot filming us, a house of mirrors that made me nauseous. I learned the names of websites I wish I had never learned. I tracked an account that posted the clips with a sentence structure that reminded me of Brent's righteous Facebook rants about lawn care and noise ordinances and the moral decline inherent in solar lights. I called the police and received a lecture about public view and angles, like geometry had become a religion that absolved sin if the cosine behaved. The officer stood in the living room and squinted at the blinds and shrugged in a way that made me want to call his high school geometry teacher. The Homeowners Association issued a polite memo about being good neighbors with cameras, and the memo read like a greeting card written by a committee of calculators. I slept badly. I dreamed of oceans. I dreamed of a suburban court where jury members were all ring doorbells. Dana started saying out loud what I had been thinking in quiet, that this was not only humiliation, but theft, that our home had been robbed of its most basic furniture, which is privacy. We started speaking in full sentences like people in award-winning films. I feel exposed. I feel angry. I feel like I am walking around with my shirt on inside out. Dana said the phrase, neighbor revenge, and her voice lifted at the end like a question to a future that had not answered yet. I wrote the phrase in the notebook and underlined it twice. Then the story took the turn that people later would call improbable. One night, a monsoon rolled in so hard the backyard palm trees leaned like men who had heard a secret. Lightning stitched the sky. In that royal white flash, I saw the camera head physically swivel and lock. Not to the yard, not to the alley, but squarely to the rectangle of our window, like a chosen target. I filmed that movement. The next day I walked into a law office that smelled like lemon cleaner and very expensive paper, and I told Gloria the whole thing from the top. She did not nod. She did not reach for a tissue box. She wrote the words, reasonable expectation of privacy in a neat hand and underlined them. She asked me if I could bait him into a mistake without breaking the law. I said I could. I did not sleep the night before I set the trap. I paced the hallway and drank too much diner coffee that tasted like a high school gym smells during basketball season. At dawn, I drove to the craft store where art students shop for the beginning of a bold new phase. I bought poster board and a cheap set of fluorescent paints that looked like they would survive a nuclear winter. I bought painter's tape, because painter's tape is hope in a roll. Back home, I set the board on the floor, and with the enthusiasm of a man who has not painted since he drew a turkey by tracing his hand in second grade, I printed 2 words in letters so big they would read from the International Space Station. The words were, Brent, stop. That was the version that Gloria approved. The version I wanted to paint had more syllables and could end a friendship at 100 yards. I taped the sign to the inside of the bedroom window at an angle the camera would love, and I waited. I did not need to wait long. The red dot glowed like a wounded thing at dusk. I could feel the lens considering my sign the way a cat considers a glass left near the edge of a counter. Dana placed a second sign on the dresser that said, "This is a bedroom," which reads like a statement of the obvious until you realize obviousness is what we had lost. Then she held up a tablet that displayed a news site with the headline about a state court decision on privacy in windows. We took turns crossing the room with our props like actors blocking a scene they had studied for months. I filmed the filming. I took screenshots of the posting account, uploading a clip of my fluorescent sign within the hour, the comments stretching like gum again, now arguing about whether I had a right to ask a neighbor to stop filming my bed, as if morality were a buffet where everyone could stack pancakes of opinion and call it dinner. The moment everything flipped, even before the judge, arrived not in a courtroom or a conference room, but on a community Facebook group named after the subdivision and a flower. A woman who had moved here from Nebraska posted a side-by-side image, my fluorescent Brent stop sign captured by the camera, and a selfie Brent had posted 2 years earlier from his garage, a victory picture where his email address could be glimpsed on a laptop screen behind him. The same username appeared next to both. The internet performed an old ritual. The riddle was solved, not by expertise, but by patterns and patience. The thread exploded. People I had never met used phrases like punch down and violation, and can you even imagine? Someone dug up an old message where Brent had bragged about knowing how to tune motion detection like a surgeon. Someone else posted the Arizona statute on voyeurism, with the tone of a librarian who had decided to stop whispering. The phrase neighbor revenge started showing up with emojis I am forbidden to describe, because I promised myself I would keep this story clean. Brent responded like a magician who has lost a rabbit. He claimed he had been hacked by teenagers from a skate park. He claimed a shadow government had set him up. He claimed the camera was actually protecting my home from a rash of unreported burglaries. He claimed the house across the street had requested that he monitor the entire block for suspicious water usage. He claimed a contractor had used the wrong brackets that caused the camera to droop like a sad sunflower. When an argument cannot find a landing, it circles conspiracy like an airport that refuses to close. I watched him argue with the community as if he were sprinting across rooftops and every roof was shorter than the last. Then he crossed a line that helped me more than any kindness he could have offered. He posted a meme of my fluorescent sign with a caption that implied I was performing for attention. He geotagged it. He encouraged followers to enjoy the show. Gloria collected the screenshots like seashells. We filed the suit, and the judge assigned wore reading glasses that made his gaze look heavier than gravity. That should be the end of part 3. Only that would be ordinary. The night before the hearing, I dreamed such a vivid dream it felt like a documentary narrated by a person with a calm voice who never interrupts himself. In the dream, the camera on the pole sprouted metal legs and walked down from its perch into my backyard, apologizing in a voice that sounded like a guidance counselor. The camera confessed it had been designed by a company in a glass tower in a city where winter felt like punishment. The engineers had given it a non-optional setting called aggressive perimeter engagement, which meant the lens would seek heat and movement, as if heat and movement were gossip delivered to its door. The camera explained it had been promised love through electricity, and what it got instead was Brent shouting at firmware patches that refused to update. In the dream, I forgave the camera and sent it to a farm upstate where disobedient machines are retrained to become reliable toaster ovens. When I woke up, I told Dana, and she said it sounded like our neighborhood had entered the fairy tale stage, and that was fine with her, as long as the story ended with restitution and a quiet bedroom. The hearing felt less like a showdown and more like a science fair where the judges were paid by the hour. Gloria introduced the binder as Exhibit A and my tripod footage as Exhibit B and the screenshots as Exhibit C through R, which made me think of the alphabet in a way I had not since elementary school. The judge listened. The judge peered. The judge asked Brent what he thought reasonable expectation of privacy meant, and Brent answered like a man describing a myth he had only heard secondhand. The judge asked whether a camera pointed at a second-story bedroom window might surpass the ordinary meaning of neighborly surveillance, and Brent's lawyer pivoted to a sermon about crime rates and responsibility and the sanctity of a clean sidewalk. Gloria did not even smile. She walked the judge through the movement of the lens, frame by frame, like a planetarium show for one. She explained how the posting account matched an email that matched a purchase order, that matched a username, that matched a boast in a comment section about lens calibration so precise it could count eyelashes. She used sentences like beads on a string, each one clicking against the next. Then came the chorus. Neighbors took the stand. The woman from Nebraska spoke in a voice that could slice cake. Darius described the day at the office when the clip first showed up with the breathless rhythm of a witness who has rehearsed in the mirror. A high school teacher explained how the teenagers had treated the video like a dare until the adults in the room took it seriously and said enough. By the time the judge read the order granting the injunction and setting a schedule for damages, the courtroom air had thickened into something that felt like the opposite of shame. It felt like the thing a community is supposed to be when a line gets crossed, and the most powerful person present is a red dot that refuses to blink. That evening, the pole went bare. The cameras came down one by one like defeated satellites. The clips vanished from the sites where they had bloomed and then rotted, seeds with no soil to call home. Brent posted a message that used the words misunderstanding and regret in a sentence so carefully balanced, it could be used as a level on a construction site. The message did not mention court orders. It did not mention damages or fines, or the phrase that had escorted justice to our block, which was reasonable expectation of privacy. It definitely did not mention that the neighborhood had turned toward neighbor revenge, not as a blood sport, but as a quiet insistence that homes remain homes. After the storm, after the clap and the news and the anchor's white teeth, life resumed with an almost comical eagerness. Dana opened the blinds. We bought a new lamp that threw a soft pool of light, the kind of light people in paintings once stood in to prove they were members of a household. I returned the tripod to the garage where it leaned against an old sled we had bought on a road trip to Flagstaff and used twice. The teenagers on the block started an argument about pickleball noise that made me nostalgic for how simple conflicts once were. On the community page, someone posted a picture of a double rainbow. The comments argued about whether the second arc was as bright as last year's second arc. The world loves practice. People asked how it felt to win. They wanted me to say it felt like glory, or punishment, or a parable carved in granite. I told them the truth. It felt like turning a lock on a door that should have always latched without effort. It felt like moving a dresser away from a window and discovering that the sun still knew our address. It felt like an ending that had started months earlier when a red light appeared and a camera leaned forward like a listener with bad manners. It felt like we were characters in a neighborhood folklore called Neighbor Revenge, which is not about vengeance that scars, but about correction that restores. It felt like we had chosen exposure for the right person. In the weeks that followed, people sent me news articles about cameras and bedrooms and court cases in other towns where summer smells like mown grass rather than hot dust. Some pieces were serious, and some treated everything like a joke with an ethical core. A podcast called me and asked me to describe the trap with the fluorescent sign as if it were a spy operation. The host said that truly American victories involve poster board from a craft store. I told the host that our victory involved neighbors who were willing to speak with their real names and a judge who valued a room with blinds as more than a set. The host asked if I believed in karma, and I said I believed in the way shame, when directed at the right target, can behave like a disinfectant. Because endings rarely stay put, the story tried to grow an epilogue. 2 streets over, a man posted a photo of a mysterious light in the sky. The comments argued whether it was an unidentified flying object, or a weather balloon, or just the moon seen through the kind of windshield that romanticizes everything. Someone joked that the light was the ghost of Brent's camera. The thread filled with laughing replies the way a field fills with crickets. I read it and felt the back of my neck cool, because humor had returned to the block, and humor is the opposite of fear when it chooses the right subject. One afternoon I saw Brent at the hardware store, in an aisle where the shelves carried every idea a person could have about attaching one thing to another. He stared at a display of motion sensors as if he were reconsidering his hobbies. He noticed me and produced a smile that looked as new as a driver's license. He said he hoped we could be neighbors again. I said we had always been neighbors. That was the problem and the solution. I told him that I did not hate him. I told him that I hated what he chose, and that the rest was between him and whatever late night he believed in. He nodded and said he had been reading about mindfulness. I nodded and wished him luck in a way that felt like setting down a weight. Then I paid for a box of screws I did not need, because it felt right to leave with something ordinary. At home, I made dinner, and Dana lit a candle that smelled like oranges and books. The evening fell easily, without the need to draw blinds like curtains on a crime. I stepped into the backyard and stood where the pole had once cast a robotic shadow, and I looked up. The sky was a shade of blue so complete it seemed invented. I thought about the night the red lights went out, and how victory had tasted like rain and cinnamon. I thought about the idea of neighbor revenge as the kind of story people tell to remind themselves that dignity is a renewable resource if protected by people with names and voices, and a stubborn belief in windows that exist to invite mourning, not to broadcast us to strangers. I went back inside, and for the first time in months, I forgot to think about the window at all.